Think Again TV is produced by Centre for Inquiry, Canada's premier venue for secular humanists, atheists, skeptics, and free thinkers.
A Huffington Post article that you authored in March of this year while you were running for leadership of the Liberal Party of Canada. And it was mostly around the issue you've referred to, Quebec's signature or lack thereof on the Constitution. But in that article, you mentioned the, quote, very important and serious step of drafting a modern and inclusive preamble to our Constitution. And then you went on and said, quote, certainly the time is overdue to enact an inspiring preamble that accurately describes our great and diverse nation. Can you explain what you meant by those comments and what you were hoping to generate by writing that down?
That was the first time I went back to see what preamble are they talking about. And so this is where you discover the history, because there is no preamble in the BNA Act of the 1867. There was a flowery one that does refer to law, God and sundry other things in the Bill of Rights, but that of course is not an entrenched document. And that's where we discovered that there is this, you see this preamble that says Canada is, or I can't remember the exact words, dedicated to principles that recognize the supremacy of God and the rule of law. In every piece of legislation that goes in, often there'll be a preamble, and in lots of stuff that you guys, I'm sure, are involved in, where it's supposed to set out the general principles and all of that. Everybody here must be really well aware of the United States. We, the people of the United States, coming together with justice and, you know, all of this. And that their preamble it was bringing together 13 colonies at the time, you know, and all of that. So the constitutional preamble is, to my mind, it's in our case, it would be valuable because I think we've cobbled together this document of 1867, which is very workmanlike, and it's all, you know, just very dry, and the four provinces, the founding provinces are coming together to do this and that. And we have the division of powers, nothing that talks about people in any real way. And in 1982, we suddenly have the charter, and things flip, and people feel they own the Constitution. So, and we should remember the preamble that I'm referring to is the one to the 1982 Act. So we have these two acts in play. So I guess to the answer, do we need one? I do think it would be a good idea if we could do it.
Well, this is where I wanted to go next, is the origins of the inclusion of God. Are you, having looked at that history to some extent, are you suggesting that it was motivated largely by religious conservative elements within one party or another that pushed?
You know what, I haven't studied enough, and clearly there isn't that much out there. But I can just tell you from you know, my educated guess is that what went on was mostly all about veto powers for Quebec, the amending formula of the charter, and all of this. And this preamble at one point wasn't even there, and it got dropped. And then you're dealing with all the pressure from conservative groups as well as the equality groups who were asking for stuff. And I'm sure that at some point, just the same way they had that night of the kitchen, whatever, when they were putting it together, somebody said, let's see if this will at least work and hold down that opposition. So I think it's just a very political...
At least we can count on that special interest group and we can move on and
exactly.
not worry about that.
How did we actually arrive at somebody saying, hey, here's something I'd like to include?
Yeah.
I mean, where did this come from? After 117 years with evidence.
Canadian Bill of Rights, 1960. Does have a reference to God and is a much more elaborate. It has other stuff, which is actually not bad, you know, but commitment to justice and all of this. So that's where that's Diefenbaker, 1960, right?
One thing I've always been curious about, if you take the preamble just on its own merits, where it says, whereas Canada is founded upon principles that recognize the supremacy of God and the rule of law. Mm-hmm. Supremacy means, well, supreme, singular. Mm-hmm. So, but then we have God and the rule of law. Mm-hmm. So if there is a conflict between these two supreme principles, So
You rolled a coin?
so forgetting about Section 2 and freedom of conscience and just dealing with the preamble on its own merits, I was hoping I could get some insight from you as to, I guess, how that, what were they thinking? Not just, partially from a secularist perspective, but have a supremacy of multiple potentially conflicting principles is contradictory and incoherent, and I was hoping to get some insight on what they were thinking, how that might be applied, or is it just flowery language that, as you've indicated, we can just ignore in its entirety and get to the meat of things?
I have to say, I did actually teach constitutional law for 2 years, and I never paid attention to it. It's just so ridiculous. I mean, I agree with you. It is just, and so actually the more we're talking about it now, I'm thinking, God, this thing is really, I can't explain it. And I'm not going to defend the people that put it in. I mean, it seems that the Prime Minister himself afterwards said, I don't even, we don't know why. And it's sort of the worst of what, of what happens when you have to compromise. And so somehow, even in those days, now, having said that, don't forget this was pre-charter because it was just creating the charter. So it was a bunch of guys sitting around, lots of trade-offs going on, and it was really the organized women's groups and Aboriginal groups that were bringing that element, and we had the right leadership at the time through, through Mr. Trudeau and many others that were bringing, in fact, that was the power base they had to draw from the people. For example, Manitoba Premier was going to threaten not to pass it until it was said, well, let's say, you're going into an election, you're going to lose. There are all these people organizing to bring him down. And so it was just amazing, things going on. I wasn't even around. I was in England observing, ridiculous things with people coming over to, beg Mr. Thatcher to do this or that. And I'm thinking, wow, we're really, in the dark ages here. So, but this is what I read. So the politician in me is just telling you, it's the embarrassing thing. We don't. It should never have happened, but we just were not, they were not willing at that time to engage in a stare down. Let me just point out, for example, the stuff that was circulating in the late 70s, the pre-drafts or whatever, would have taken out the monarchy. Well, I was around there, and now I'm not a monarchist, but clearly that got dropped very early on, and so there were lots of, there'll be lots of people around, notwithstanding clause. That's silly, and so it has some merit. I would argue that it does not necessary. I'm willing to say, okay, it's hardly ever used now, and in a few more years it'll be just drifting into desuetude or whatever the expression is. But still, so many compromises are made, and this one is like one major, mess, and we ended up with this preamble.
My thinking, given the comments that were made afterwards, both by Mr. Trudeau, by Hogg, by Peter Hogg and others, is that this was finally, okay, what can we do to get this off the table? Let's get it settled so we just don't worry about it. And so I'm sure somewhere in the dusty bin somewhere is a legal opinion that says this will mean nothing. It is a summary of what was in the Bill of Rights. For all those people that are on your back and you don't want to be screaming about the Charter, it'll satisfy them. There's a reference to God.
I can add a bit of historical background.
Great.
Have some content here that may be of interest to you. Like Deborah was saying, debates were going on in 1981 and large letter writing campaign by the conservative religious crowd. Chrétien said it was the #1 topic for which they received letters. And ultimately there was a rookie MP who's now a senator by the name of David Smith, who came to Trudeau with a recommendation of including it, and his bullet points supporting adding it were as follows. This is virtually an instant issue, but it's so simple and straightforward that, quite frankly, it is the only aspect of the constitutional debate some evangelicals understand.
He's just quoting there. This isn't Greg speaking here.
Yeah, many view our reaction to it as a litmus paper test on whether our collective leadership, but particularly the PM, place a high value on spiritual matters and are prepared to recognize the sovereignty of God. To evangelicals, the only position is that is satisfactory is inclusion. There are no explanations for its exclusion that will wash, particularly blaming the premiers. And finally, in fact, at the First Ministers' Conference in September, none of them referred to or objected to the inclusion of God in the draft preamble. Quebec didn't like the preamble for other reasons. No one in Canada is convinced we care too much about what the Gang of Eight think about anything, and they don't really believe us when we try to pin this on them.
So this is a Liberal MP who is...
I got this from an essay written in 2000 by a guy, I forget his first name, I believe his last name is Egerton.
Oh, yeah, I saw him quoted in what I was reading, Edgerton. Well, to me, that sounds like a typical political memo. I don't think it necessarily means that Smith himself, who's still alive and well and in the Senate, necessarily was promoting it. To me, that sounds like political gobbledygook. Here are the things that need to be done. Nobody cares. It seems more the common thing is mostly nobody cares except for these guys. And I guess a political decision was made that it would be easier just to leave it in and have it.
Just a numbers game. They figured they had bigger fish to fry.
That's right. That's right. That's right.
This is a perfect segue, because the issue of the actual force of law or whatever persuasive force that a preamble has, that's something that I'm hoping you can comment on, because I'm not myself a legal scholar, so I've always been curious about a preamble in a document, and especially in a constitutional document. Are you aware of whether that has the same kind of, well, it doesn't have the same kind of force as the rest of the document? What kind of force of law
it
does
has? It has some force, but it is not. It has some juridical impact, and that's why it has been used. There was a case where they were about to. They found that all of Manitoba should have translated all its laws into French.
Right.
But it would have collapsed the rule of law, because it would have, if they'd literally
voided all of the,
it would have voided all the laws, and they would have been running around. So of course the court said, there's the principle of the rule of law, so you got a transition time to take place. So it's been used here and there as having some indication. And preambles, there are often preambles to pieces of legislation, whereas, whereas, and courts use that to give a general indication. And when there's a conflict within the law that they're dealing with, whether it's the Constitution or anywhere else, they'll look to it. Taken to its extreme, if we said supremacy of God had some influence, that infringes freedom of conscience. That includes the right to be atheist, for example.
The legal coherence of the concept of the supremacy of God, what that would even mean if it were to be enacted with some kind of force, and whether it's consistent with, say, Section 2, the Charter's protection for religious freedom, freedom of conscience. As a constitutional lawyer yourself, do you see some clear problems with simply working through the consistency of those different statutes if they were to be implemented in some forceful way?
It's an anomaly. I mean, we may not have started out with a stirring we the people kind of constitution, but if you look at, and I did bring it for later, there's South African constitution that did go into place in 1996. A heck of a lot more inspiring than ours. And there were a lot of Canadians down there working down there because it was federation, but at least it was all about the background, the people, and all of that. And I would say if we get into another debate about how to recognize Quebec, then, as I wrote in that article, then I would hope that the leader, the people, the politicians and the people get together and say, no, this cannot be done in isolation. It is time to write a self-respecting preamble that updates our Constitution and our country. We are no longer just this little group of provinces and premiers that come together. It is something that has to come from the people.
The only one I had seen, and we've done some research for the CSA, is the Lord's Day Act. When that was defeated, yeah. I think it must have been like a minority position or something, because obviously it was defeated. Yeah. But one of the justices did invoke the supremacy of God to I guess argue that it had some merit.
Actually, I think if I can look at my notes, there is probably the Shoppers Drug Mart case or whatever it was. But it wasn't. He was a minority.
It didn't actually change
But he was a minority.
Right.
Yeah. So you look for anything. That's the lawyer in me. You can always, when you have to, you're going to search out for the language. And but that's the only way I've seen it's used up to now.
You invoked your cousin, and actually we have a quote from Andrew Coyne on the preamble.
Is everyone quotable?
Yes, he is very much so.
Yeah.
He said that God, in this context, talking about the preamble, is simply out of place. But if it was silly to put God in, it would be equally silly to get too worked up about it. The reference is in the preamble. It has no legal weight. It is simply a statement of belief. If it is unnecessary, it is also essentially harmless. I know we've been sort of skirting around that particular issue of legal force, but as far the larger issue of whether it's harmful, I mean, somebody over here mentioned that it's invoked by, I suppose, the religious right largely as maybe a symbolic ode to the religiosity of Canada, and then that's maybe used not so much legally as perhaps in their PR and advocacy efforts. And I know this is politics, but it's also a bit more than that, this question. But if you'd like, I'd be happy to hear your commentary on that. All things considered, if we were to open these deliberations, perhaps there'd be some polarizing and some harm that way. But the way it stands now, it's forever sort of a thorn in our side, us being secularists, that can be invoked by folks who consider themselves our political opponents on the religious right. Do you think, weighing all of that, it is an issue we should take seriously as secular activists?
Here's the thing.
Anytime people like us and organizations like us or individuals try to make changes, for example, removing the Lord's Prayer from council meetings or vestiges of religious symbols, the counter-argument, the argument we make is, well, Canada is a secular country, and the counter-argument that is almost always made is like, well, no it isn't. See? God's right in the preamble to the Constitution. So it may not be rule of law, but it makes any kind of reasonable changes that much harder. The song and dance that you have to do is that much more elaborate. It takes that much more time.
Yep.
So that's why it matters.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, of course it does in that sense.
You were originally motivated by the desire to, include Quebec in a meaningful way, but that it's also meaningful to other Canadians. But do you see a role then in that deliberation to also, say, deal with the issue of God, or perhaps other related issues that perhaps should or should not be in the preamble? Is this part of a larger sort of package approach?
What I'm trying to say, because there are other issues that we need to deal with constitutionally, we do need to do something about the Senate. But one thing that we learned from Meech and Charlottetown is, first of all, don't mix it all together, where you have trade-offs being made, and it has to be a people's document. So maybe the premiers can do some of the negotiating, but no, the best thing is to set up a committee, get people involved from the beginning. This is a document that has to endure for a long, long time. It doesn't get changed very easily, and at the end of the day, it has to be voted on by people. So the preamble, we just never got around to it, because in the Meech and Charlottetown years, we just never got off the Distinct Society Clause, and finally it just died. But then when Mr. Couillard raised this again, that's when most people look at it and go, what the heck is this? How did we end up with supremacy?
Mr. Couillard being the new leader
the new leader,
provincial,
yes, the leader who presumably will someday be premier, and the separatist leader will be gone, and maybe the negotiations will start again. And I just wanted to make sure that we those of us who are concerned about it, make it clear right now that it should be any discussion of Quebec's distinctiveness, or in the preamble or otherwise, should be about defining the entire country. And that's why I'm happy to see you pick that up. We have a preamble that means nothing. I think I was Googling stuff, and apparently I saw a quote of Pierre Trudeau's at the time when he was asked about it. He said, I don't think God cares whether he's in the Constitution or not. I believe, tracing through the background to it, is that we ended up with this really abbreviated version of what was in the Bill of Rights. Juridically and all of that, it's harmless. But why I'm in politics, or have been at the hinges, I dislike that. I dislike this, and Andrew is a journalist and not a politician. I think we sit back too much in this country, and we're a bit too, well, we can't do anything about that, and that's the way it's always been. And everybody can think of other examples. And how do we protest?
A lot of people think that religious folks, who still constitute, a majority of Canadians, at least believers that is, would never let such a thing happen. And this is beyond sort of the legal conversation, but there have been some theologians, William Klassen, for example, who's actually said that it's somewhat insulting to put God into what is otherwise a secular document, that God is not well served by being used in this way. Do you think that there might actually be a way for secularists and secular-leaning religious folks to find some common ground in terms of making progress on this particular issue?
Well, listen, I just think generally the people of Canada, whether they believe in God or do not believe in God or whatever God, Christian God, Muslim God, whatever, I certainly think that there is room for everyone to understand that the preamble to a constitution has got to reflect the country, the diversity, let's say in South Africa's case, it's a history of conflict and all of that, and they very delicately get it in. In our case, this is where Quebec is relevant, our history is relevant, but I would love to see Canadians sit down. Even back in 1992, there were drafted a couple of draft preambles. And I just can't find them right now. And they were kind of flowery and from the Northwest Territories and this and that. It sounded like a bit of a song, but that's where you start. And what we are committed to as a country is equality, it's justice, it's whether you want to just refer to that as secular, or it's the nature of the country. Religion is personal. And it's not the state's job to, and this is precisely why we have freedom of conscience and religion. So I don't see, except for the Christian Heritage Party, which, oh, by the way, from what I see, that's the only one that keeps referring to it.
Well, and they say they're the only true party that recognizes the entirety of the Constitution.
And they are a tiny little percentage.
Which might tell you something right there, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So you just, there will, of course, be people that will come out and say, but that's where I see the necessary leadership to conduct the kind of debate that we want. The first opportunity, it's not the appropriate introduction to a constitution. It's not something, our preamble should express us as a people and our diversity or whatever, and the rights and freedoms that we have as individuals and as people. And at some point we will get that back into place. It never has been there.
When you said, when you made the statement about in the preamble that it really doesn't hold any weight, I thought, well, there really isn't much more to talk about at this point. As you spoke about the preamble, though, being an insomniac's dream, I tried to sort of read it one time, and it's really just, it doesn't inspire at all. And the thought that we could change the preamble and make it an inspiring document that reflects Canada and its dynamism and the people, the country as it is just really exciting that we could have that possibility.
Just in our last minute or two, I want to ask you about the timing of this kind of advocacy. As you know, we were just discussing, in 1999, Sven Robinson, an NDP parliamentarian, did put forward a petition that was signed by, I think, 1,000 of his constituents to remove God from the preamble. And he was chastised even by his own party. Mm-hmm. So I'm curious, it has been, 14, 15 years since then. Do you see that the appetite for either the larger constitutional debate I know you're ready to have, or the more focused deliberations about the issue of God in the preamble, do you think the timing is more right now for that?
You said you're a lone wolf. Do you know anybody else that would be people?
Well, I mean, I'm a lone wolf in the sense that I write this too. All I know is that whenever I do raise this a lot, gosh, it got raised even when I was going across the country. Everybody agrees. They just haven't thought about it, and they go, oh, is that right? Is that, So I would say it's kind of like the opposition to Nietzsche or whatever. It was all there. It just needed a voice. It needed the leadership. But what I see so much cynicism, so much narrow thinking going on, and I can't see it. Being able to spontaneously make it an issue. Now, I'm thinking. I think through it. There is the 150th anniversary coming up. Well, Mr. Harper, in much longer, we're going to be celebrating every military exploit we ever had, which is very, is yay. But he's got a different take on it. Everything's political. So, maybe you could start one there. Yeah. A new preamble for, the 150th anniversary. We are a very unique, incredible nation. I mean, I love talking about it. I'm not going to talk about it right now, but why can't we finally kind of do something that would bring us together? It's the Canada, yay. That was my mantra.
The time is right now to have a discussion which says we're about to turn 150. Let's figure out what, can we describe our nation now in a coherent way? And it'll be very much a sum of the parts and references here and there, but there is a core that is bringing us together, and it is our diversity and the commitment to justice and equality and openness and all of that.
Those all sound like a lot better values,
Absolutely.
more appropriate, more Canadian values to have there in the
Well, that's
preamble.
it. What you're looking for are the values that unite us and that do not divide us, and that should lead where it should lead, to something quite interesting, where we could all say, yeah, this is good.
Well, it has been interesting, and you've given us a lot to think about, a lot
All
of fruitful avenues for consideration. Thank you so much, Deborah Coyne, for joining us here on Think Again TV.
Thank you very much.
Think Again TV is produced by Centre for Inquiry, Canada's premier venue for secular humanists, atheists, skeptics, and free thinkers.
CFI Canada coordinates branches and campus groups across the country, runs a public education series, provides secular community services, incorporates cutting-edge multimedia such as blogs, podcasts, and YouTube, and is a regular voice in the press presenting a secular humanist, atheist, and skeptical perspective.
It seems to me that if we're going to include God's name in the Constitution, we should ask his permission.
Exactly.